The restaurant was one of those high-end establishments where the clientele expected a certain level of exclusivity. The ambiance was carefully curated, the lighting just dim enough to give an air of mystery, and the servers moved with a precision that suggested they were trained not just in hospitality, but in discretion. Every detail of the place spoke of a carefully maintained image, the kind that catered to an elite crowd while ensuring that only those deemed acceptable felt truly welcome. Pam Bondi entered that evening without any fanfare. She wasn't the type to demand attention. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of standing firm in high-pressure situations. She had spent her career in rooms filled with people who underestimated her, and she had never once been intimidated. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she had a presence that commanded respect. As she was shown to her table, a few patrons took notice, their eyes flickering toward her with a mix of recognition and curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, some simply observed. It wasn't unusual for someone like her to dine in such a place, but there were always those who carried their opinions just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to bring them to light. The cue. Tension, though subtle at first, began to make itself known. It wasn't immediate, nor was it overt, but there were small signs. The way certain staff members exchanged glances, the almost imperceptible delay in service. It was the kind of passive resistance that spoke volumes without a single word needing to be said. Pam noticed, of course. She had dealt with this kind of reaction before. It wasn't new to her. People often made assumptions about her, about what she stood for, about who she was. But she had long since learned not to react too quickly. Instead, she observed, waiting to see how things would unfold. She placed her order, her voice calm, betraying nothing. The server hesitated for half a second too long before scribbling it down and walking away. Across the room, more whispers. A few disapproving glances. It was as if her very presence had unsettled something in the carefully controlled atmosphere of the restaurant. The energy in the room shifted again when a group at a nearby table grew louder, their conversation deliberately amplified just enough to ensure she could hear. Their words weren't directed at her by name, but the message was clear. They spoke in broad strokes, disguising their comments as casual discussion, but the intent was unmistakable. Still, Pam remained composed. She was used to this. She had faced far worse in far more serious settings, but she also knew that patience had its limits. Then came the moment that changed everything. A figure emerged from the back of the restaurant, moving with a kind of authority that suggested they were more than just another employee. The air in the room seemed to shift as this person approached, their expression carefully constructed to appear professional, but there was an undeniable tension just beneath the surface. A brief exchange followed, calm at first, measured. Words were chosen carefully, but the message was clear. The restaurant had a certain standard to uphold. There were concerns. Perhaps it would be best if she dined elsewhere. Pam listened, her expression unreadable. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding, not with anger, not with outrage, but with a simple question. One that required an answer the other person wasn't quite prepared to give. There was a pause, an awkward shuffle, a weak attempt to maintain control of the situation. But Pam already knew how this would play out. She stood, not because she had been intimidated, but because she had already decided that this place wasn't worth her time. She had dealt with people like this before, people who mistook arrogance for principle, who believed that their personal biases granted them the authority to decide who belonged and who didn't. She didn't argue. She didn't plead her case. She simply gathered her things and walked out, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with tension that the silence that followed was almost deafening. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly have understood in that moment, was that this was far from over. The next evening, the restaurant carried on as usual. The staff moved efficiently through the dimly lit space, their practiced smiles and carefully measured words creating the illusion of effortless elegance. Patrons sipped their wine, engaged, in hushed conversations that hummed beneath the soft background music. It was another night in a place that prided itself on exclusivity, on maintaining an atmosphere that catered to a particular kind of clientele. Outside, the valet attendants stood at their posts watching as luxury vehicles rolled up one after another. It was a routine they knew well, opening doors, offering polite greetings, exchanging glances when something particularly impressive pulled up. They had seen their share of high-end cars, but when this one arrived, something was different. The Yao Rolls-Royce moved smoothly through the entrance, its deep, polished finish reflecting the ambient glow of the streetlights. The car commanded attention without effort, its presence alone enough to shift the energy around it. The engine purred as it came to a stop, and for a moment, there was silence. The valet nearest to the car hesitated, glancing toward his colleague, as if seeking confirmation that they were both seeing the same thing. There was an unspoken understanding in the brief exchange of looks. This was not an ordinary arrival. The door opened with the soft precision of fine craftsmanship, and the figure who stepped out did so with a kind of presence that was impossible to ignore. There was no rush, no urgency. Every movement was deliberate, exuding a quiet authority that required no announcement. The staff inside took notice almost immediately. Through the large front windows, a few caught sight of the arrival, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something else entirely. Some turned quickly back to their duties, as if pretending not to notice, while others exchanged glances, uncertain about what, if anything, they should do. There was a moment of hesitation at the entrance. The host stationed at the front desk straightened slightly, instinctively preparing to engage with whoever was about to walk through the doors. There was an expectation, an unspoken rule in places like this, that dictated how guests were to be received. But as the footsteps approached, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, one of recognition, of realization. A few nearby diners turned in their seats, sensing the change. Conversations quieted ever so slightly. The same people who had whispered and exchanged knowing glances the previous night now found themselves looking toward the entrance with something closer to uncertainty. The figure stepped forward with the kind of ease that suggested complete control of the moment. There was no need for grand gestures or raised voices. The presence alone was enough. A server, uncertain whether to approach, lingered for a fraction of a second too long before deciding against it. Others, who had been so sure of themselves before, now found their confidence wavering. Across the room, those who had been most vocal the previous evening sat in uncomfortable silence, pretending to be engrossed in their meals, their wine glasses, anything that kept them from making direct eye contact. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Whatever had been assumed the night before, whatever certainty had fueled the decisions that had been made, was now being reconsidered in real time. And yet, the energy in the room made it clear that this wasn't about retaliation. There was no need for raised voices, no demand for explanations. The message had already been sent without a single word needing to be spoken. As the minutes stretched on, the reality of the situation settled in. There was no way to ignore what was happening. The silence from those who had been so quick to act before was proof enough. Every person in the room now understood that something significant had just shifted. The moment stretched longer than anyone had anticipated, a silence that carried weight far beyond the typical pause in conversation. It wasn't just about who had arrived, it was about what that arrival represented. Those who had been so sure of their words and actions the night before now found themselves uncertain, their confidence slowly unraveling as the reality of the situation settled in. A server, one of the same who had hesitated in their service the previous evening, now stood motionless near the entrance, unsure of whether to step forward or keep a safe distance. The host, who had so effortlessly dictated the flow of guests the night before, suddenly looked less certain, their carefully rehearsed professionalism faltering under the weight of realization. And then, the next moment came. A deliberate step forward, the air in the restaurant tightening as eyes followed. There was no need for a raised voice or a dramatic display. Some things carried more power in silence than they ever could in words. The presence alone was enough to shift the entire energy of the space. A slight murmur rippled through a few tables, but no one dared to speak too loudly. The same people who had whispered so confidently before, who had made their opinions clear with a smirk, a glance, or a dismissive laugh, now sat quietly, their hands resting a little too still on their silverware, their gazes carefully avoiding direct contact. The weight of the previous night's decision had settled on everyone now, hanging heavy in the air, though no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Some looked down at their plates, feigning distraction. Others stiffened, slightly in their seats, their postures betraying their discomfort. The difference between last night and tonight was stark. A manager, the one who had been at the center of the previous evening's events, now stood at a distance, shifting slightly as if unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Their face, which had held such certainty before, was now carefully neutral, betraying only the smallest flicker of unease. The presence at the entrance did not waver, did not rush, did not demand anything. There was no need. The mere act of standing there, of being in that space, was more powerful than any argument could ever be. It spoke volumes. It was a reminder, one that everyone in the room understood, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Somewhere, near the back of the restaurant, a group that had been particularly vocal the night before sat in stiff silence, their laughter from the previous night long gone. One of them shifted slightly, glancing toward the entrance before looking away. Just as quickly, another cleared their throat, reaching for their wine glass, anything to occupy their hands. The tension was thick, undeniable, but it wasn't the kind of tension that begged for a confrontation. It was the kind that made people reconsider. The kind that forced them to acknowledge that perhaps they had been too quick to judge, too eager to impose their own assumptions without ever pausing to consider the full picture. And yet, there was no anger in the presence that now stood before them. No gloating, no smug satisfaction, just quiet certainty, the kind that needed no embellishment. A few servers exchanged glances, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager took half a step forward, as if preparing to say something, but then hesitated, seeming to realize that anything they said in that moment would only make the situation worse. The unspoken message was clear. The decision that had been made the night before had not gone unnoticed. Actions had consequences, even in the most carefully curated spaces. And sometimes the most powerful response required no words at all. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, thick and unspoken, yet understood by everyone present. What had begun as an ordinary evening had transformed into something else entirely. The presence that now stood at the heart of the restaurant carried with it a quiet authority, a force that did not need to be announced. The very air had changed, the atmosphere taut with a realization that settled over the staff and patrons alike. At the front desk, the host, who had carried such confidence, the night before now seemed hesitant, hands folded neatly in front, a breath held just a little too long, an uncertain glance toward the dining area as if searching for guidance that would not come. There was no script for this situation, no rehearsed line to smooth over what had already transpired. The guests who had been most vocal the previous night now seemed smaller, their boldness stripped away by the weight of the unexpected. Some stared down at their plates, feigning distraction. Others took slow sips from their, drinks, their gazes darting across the room, avoiding direct eye contact. Their laughter from the night before had vanished, replaced by an uneasy quiet that said far more than words ever could. Among the staff, whispers passed like a current, subtle yet unmistakable. Servers who had moved so effortlessly the night before now hesitated with each step, unsure whether to proceed as usual or acknowledge the presence that had altered the evening's course. There was an unspoken understanding that what was happening was not just another routine moment, but something far greater. A manager lingered near the edge of the dining area, stiff, uncertain. Their posture betrayed an internal battle, whether to step forward and attempt to take control of the situation or remain in the background, hoping the moment would pass without escalation. Their certainty from the previous night was nowhere to be found. The reality of the decision made the night before had settled in, no longer an abstract choice but a tangible weight that could not be ignored. The carefully crafted environment, designed to cater to a particular kind of patron, now felt fragile under the weight of an undeniable truth. Perception was not always reality, and actions, no matter how small, carried consequences. The silence stretched, filling the space between tables, between breaths, between thoughts left unspoken. It was not a silence of discomfort, but one of understanding. Those who had felt so certain, so justified, now found themselves questioning. Not because they had been confronted with anger or outrage, but because they had been met with something far more powerful: certainty. The message had been delivered not in words, not in confrontation, but in presence alone. A reminder that every action, every choice, had repercussions. That the world did not always bend to the assumptions of those who believed they held control. That dignity, when wielded with quiet strength, was far more powerful than arrogance ever could be. Single server, perhaps the only one brave enough to break the heavy quiet, stepped forward. Their voice, when they spoke, was softer than usual, the typical polish of customer service tinged with something else, respect, maybe even a hint of regret. But the response did not come in words. Just a nod. Just a moment of acknowledgement. Before steps were taken toward the exit. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. There was no need for dramatics, no need for further explanation. The realization would linger long after the moment had passed, long after the presence had gone. Some would reflect on it in private, turning it over in their minds, recognizing what had truly taken place. Others would pretend it had never happened, convincing themselves that the unease they felt was imagined. But deep down, every person in that room knew the truth. The past 24 hours had shifted something, revealing the fragile nature of assumptions and the weight of quiet power. And nothing in that restaurant would ever feel quite the same again. As the door closed behind the departing figure, the restaurant remained frozen in a silence that felt almost unnatural. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered, settling into every corner of the room like an undeniable truth that could not be brushed aside. The carefully curated exclusivity of the establishment, the sense of control that had once felt absolute, now seemed paper-thin. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying thoughts they were too proud to speak aloud. Some shifted in their seats, resuming their meals as if nothing had happened, hoping to restore a sense of normalcy. But the energy in the room had changed, and no amount of pretending could erase what had just transpired. Among the staff, the realization was even sharper. The servers who had hesitated the night before now carried a weight they hadn't expected. The host, once confident in their authority, remained unnervingly still, as if replaying the events in their mind. And the manager, whose decision had set this all into motion, stood motionless, staring toward the door, perhaps finally grasping the enormity of the mistake. There had been no shouting, no grand confrontation. That was what made it so powerful. The response had been measured, effortless, undeniable. It had stripped away every ounce of false superiority that had once filled the room. Somewhere in the back, a whisper broke through the quiet, a hushed voice murmuring something to a companion. It was a simple observation, one that needed no elaboration. They knew. They all knew. Actions have consequences. Decisions, no matter how small, carry weight. The way people are treated, the assumptions made about them, the biases that dictate who is welcome and who is not, all of it matters. And now, this place, this restaurant, would forever be marked by the lesson it had just learned. Some would pretend nothing had changed. Others would walk away with a deeper understanding, but none of them